So this is the new braided steel brake hose and the brake line, and then these are the two bolts that mount the caliper to the lower fork slider on the right side. To install the brake hose, I loosened up the clamp bolt here on the right side handlebar control so it'll rotate. Now I slid the handlebar control out, and the fitting on the end of the brake hose is solid, so actually to install it I have to rotate the entire brake hose to get it to go in, and that's the reason I loosened up the handlebar control so I can rotate this around and help get all that in there. Now I thread the other end of the brake hose back behind the headlight bracket toward the middle, and there's enough room to get it through, and then I can pull it down like this. Now I bring it down like that and rotate the handlebar control so I don't put a kink in it, and then I can mount it in this bracket that's then put under the bolt that's on the lower yoke clamp. Now there's a split rubber grommet that fits in the bracket, so it just can go over the hose like that, and then I can slide it in to the bracket, and there, that's got the hose in the bracket. Now I rotated the right handlebar control so the line will fit here in this opening under the dash, and then I tightened up the pinch bolt. The other end of the brake hose fits in this bracket, which is attached to the fork slider on the right side, and it's the rear fork brace bolt. So the bracket goes under the head of the bolt, and then it goes on the inside of the fork brace, and it has a rubber grommet. So the end of the brake hose slides into the rubber grommet like that. Now the brake caliper is going to mount to these two bolt holes that are threaded on the right side of the fork slider. Now I'm using stainless steel bolts, and there's a big flat washer underneath the bolt head. So because they're stainless, I put some anti-seize on the threads. Now the standard bolts are torqued to 26 foot-pounds, but I derated this to 21 because I don't want to strip the threads since anti-seize acts as a lubricant. Now the bolts that clamp the caliper halves together I had just finger tightened, so I torque them up to 22 foot-pounds to make sure they're tight. There we go. Okay, got the caliper halves nice and secure. And then the brake line will screw into the bottom like this, and the other end will fit in to the hole in the brake caliper. I found it was easier to install the brake line by starting the connector here into the caliper and getting that to go in about halfway, and then putting the second connector into the brake hose fitting, and then tightening them up alternately. Now notice that the bleed valve is on the outside of the caliper, and the brake line going in is on the inside. Now before I install the new brake rotor, I'm going to clean it with brake cleaner because it's probably got some oil and machining solvents on it, and I definitely don't want to foul up the brake pads. This rotor was pretty clean. There was just a little bit of debris, but mostly it was in great shape. Now I put a little brake fluid on the end of a Q-tip, and I clean the inside of the holes as well in case there's any garbage in there, and work my way all the way around the brake rotor. So I'm going to install a new disc brake rotor on the front wheel. One thing to be sure is that you look at the tire where it has the arrow, and that's the direction of going forward. And I marked my hub with a tag for left, so that means the side without the tag is the right side, and that's where I'm going to mount the brand new disc rotor. So the rotor mounts with 5 Allen head bolts, and on each bolt is 2 washers and a locking nut. So I start off by just inserting 2 of the bolts and a flat washer under the head, and I run it through on the right side. Then I put the other flat washer, a little bit of anti-seize on the threads, and the lock nut finger tight, which just holds everything together, and then I'll put in all the rest of the bolts and nuts and get everything ready. Now the torque on the bolts for the brake rotor are from 16 to 18 foot-pounds, but since I put some anti-seize on it, I derated that down to 15, and I found if I stood the wheel up and kind of leaned it against my workbench, I could do an easier job of torquing it. And on the back I had to put a 13 mil box on the end of the nut and then torqued them up all the way around. So I temporarily mounted the front wheel so that I can bleed the brakes, and it's looking kind of nice. So I'm ready to fill the front brake with brake fluid and bleed it, and I put a 11 millimeter box end on the bleed nipple on the front caliper. Now the brake reservoir indicates .4 brake fluid, which is what I've got, and I always use a new bottle. I never use an old one. After loosening the 3 bolts, the top of the reservoir just pulls out, and there we go. I put some fresh .4 fluid in the reservoir, and with the bleed valve closed on the caliper, I start pumping to help fill the caliper and get any air that might be easily removed from the master cylinder. And I keep doing that for a little while. So I just rapidly pump the brake lever, and I keep getting a stream of bubbles, sometimes some big ones. Like I say, I do that for a little while. Really helps get a lot of the air out of the system. So I'm going to use my air zapper to pull the air out of the system. And there's a line that goes up to the bleed valve on the caliper, and then a second line goes up to a little suction pump, and I can pull the fluid and air out of the system. What I'll do is start the pump, and then I'll crack open the bleed valve, and should pull a lot of fluid and air out. And then I'll keep my eye on the brake fluid reservoir to make sure it's got fluid in it and doesn't go dry. There, as you can see, it's pulling fluid on out of the system, and hopefully air as well. After pulling fluid out of the caliper with the brake zapper, the lever's hard, so I think I've got most of the air out of it. A little trick I like is to pull the brake lever back about halfway and secure it with a small bungee, which keeps the brake system under pressure. And I let it sit overnight, and what will happen is any small air bubbles are going to have a tendency to want to come up to the high point, which here is the brake fluid reservoir. So it'll get any last little bits of air out of the system.